Hi, I'm Mark Anthony. I'm known as Mark Anthony JD Psychic Explorer. I'm also known as the Psychic Lawyer. And I'm a fourth generation psychic medium, paranormal expert, near-death experience researcher, and psychic medium. I communicate with spirits. I grew up in a family of mediums. This is an ability that has run for generations on both sides of my family. And both my father and my mother had these abilities, and my dad was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and then after the Navy he became a NASA engineer, and my mother was an artist. And throughout my life I've been surrounded by near-death experiences. My father had two of them. My mother had at least one that I know of, and then I had one when I was about 4 years old, and I write about it extensively in my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency. And in The Afterlife Frequency, the subtitle is The Scientific Proof of Spiritual Contact and How That Awareness Will Save Your Life or Change Your Life. And when I was a small child, the term NDE, near-death experience, wasn't very popular. And if you back up before that, my father, when he was 16 years old, he was in a terrible car accident. And he said that all of a sudden he saw himself floating above the scene of the wreckage, and he saw his body laying on the ground and a bunch of people around him, and they were doing compressions on his chest. And he said, "Wow, this feels really great." He said, "I'm dead." And he said that he saw this bright white light, and he said he felt really great, and a voice spoke to him. And the voice, my dad's name was Earl, it said, "Earl, it is not your time." And Dad said the next thing he knew, he was back in his body, and he said it hurt like hell because, I mean, he'd been really banged up bad, but he didn't know what exactly had happened. He didn't even know what to call it, and he was afraid to tell anybody because he was a teenager back, way back when. Well, then he had been a U.S. Navy SEAL, and we could do an entire episode on what he saw in the military. But after he got out of the Navy, he was a scuba diver. In fact, he'd even dove once with the legendary Jacques Cousteau, which I always thought was cool. I just found that out a few years ago, not long before he passed. And my dad said that he was off the coast of New Jersey, and they were diving in about 125 feet of water, which is pretty deep. And all of a sudden his regulator jammed. Now, back in those days, there was no backup system. I mean, basically that was it. And he started sucking water, and he realized he's drowning. And he said, all of a sudden, there was that light again. And he said, I didn't feel any pain. I didn't feel like I was drowning. And he heard the same voice that said, "Earl, you have to go back." And Dad said he could never explain what happened next because his regulator cleared. And he said, "Mark, in those days, once your regulator malfunctioned, that was it." He goes, "I don't know why, but for some reason it cleared," and he obviously avoided drowning. When I was a teenager, my mother, who was a very, very gifted psychic medium, she had to go into emergency surgery, and she died on the operating table. And I'll never forget being in the waiting room, and the surgeon came out, and he said, "We're probably going to lose her." And they worked on my mother, worked on her, and she said, but she had flatlined for a good 6 minutes. But she said that she went into this bright white light, and she saw her father, whom she was really close to, and she encountered her great-grandmother, or her grandmother, my great-grandmother, Giovanna, and a couple other people, and they told her, "Jeannie, you must go back." So when I was about 4 years old, and my family, we were living in Orlando at the time, my dad had gotten a job in aerospace, which we were from, the New Jersey, New York area. And so the family moved to Central Florida. And my dad had to travel a lot because of the space program. He was in Orlando because that was near Cape Kennedy, but then he had to go to Huntsville, Alabama, to the Space Center there. Then he had to go to Houston, so and then DC. So he was all over the place. And he was away on a business trip. And there was an epidemic of impetigo, just was going through the neighborhood, and all little kids caught it, and I got it. And impetigo, you get these rashes on your skin, you start getting a fever. And my mother brought me to the doctor, and he said, well, just, he'll be all right. Take him home and soak him in a bathtub with some, Clorox, some bleach in the water to relieve that. And I can remember the smell of the Clorox in the bathtub. But what the doctor didn't know is that I had a particularly severe case of impetigo, and I developed septicemia, which is a massive blood infection. And all of a sudden I went into pulmonary failure. And my mother started screaming, and my dad was away on a trip, and she scooped me up in her arms, and she told my sister, call an ambulance. And my brother, I was 4, my brother was probably 9. He ran across the street because there was a fireman that lived across the street, and he was off duty because his car was there. And we knew the guy's name was Rory, and all the kids called him Fireman Rory. We really liked him. And he ran over there. My mom ran outside and said, Mark is dying. And I remember, Rory ran across the street, and he started doing CPR on me, pounding on his chest. And then an ambulance came, and they got me on a gurney and into the ambulance. And I had almost started breathing, or I was starting to breathe again. And my mother jumped in the ambulance. They slammed the door and took off. But what happened was they put a respirator mask on me to get me oxygen. But when the door of the ambulance slammed shut, it caught the oxygen hose in there, and my oxygen got cut off. And the paramedic said, he's not breathing, we're losing him. And the next thing I knew, I shot through the ceiling of the ambulance, and I was hovering above Orange Blossom Trail. I remember that. And I'm seeing the ambulance, and all I could wonder, and I was a pretty smart little kid, I was like, why are there numbers on top of the ambulance? And if people want to find out what happened, you're going to have to read my book, The Afterlife Frequency. Because what happened there and what I encountered and the message that I received changed everything in my life. I thank God every day for the gifts that I have. And I've been very blessed with an incredible memory. My parents said that I started talking about 18 months, and I went from mama and dada to complete sentences within about a week. And then my dad said, then the questions started. Why is this? Why does that happen? How does this work? And he said the questions never ended, but he was an engineer and he liked explaining things. And I have a memory of lying in a crib when I was not even a year old. I have all these really in-depth memories, and I do recall being in the bathtub. I could smell the Clorox. I remember I couldn't breathe. I remember my mom scooping me up, and I remember the paramedics banging on my chest. Now, about the oxygen hose in the door, my mother explained this to me afterwards, because in the book I explain also detail what happened there. And then, so I recreated the story from my memories, and then what, my sister, because when I was working on writing this, I called my brother and I go, okay, he said, yeah, I ran across the street and got the firemen. And my sister said, yeah, I called the ambulance and they were on their way. And then when I had the NDE, and like I said, in the book, I go into great detail about that. And then when I started working with my mediumship, I started seeing a connection between the brain and how these things are possible. We know from science that everything is created of molecules, which in turn are made of atoms, which in turn are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which in turn are composed of the smallest particle of pure electromagnetic energy known as a quantum. And that's where the term quantum physics comes from. And just to make sure for all of our science friends, electrons are a negatively charged quantum because an electron is 1/1800th the size of a proton. So now that we've established that, I developed, and I put this in my book, The Afterlife Frequency. I introduced this in my book, The Afterlife Frequency, the term the electromagnetic soul, to describe what we really are, which is pure consciousness. That's what we call this in the realm of science and psychology and psychiatry. You call it a soul or a spirit in matters of faith, but we are pure consciousness that is eternal electromagnetic energy. And so when the physical body dies and the brain is an organ in the body, the brain does not create consciousness. It merely hosts it. Think of your brain like a computer hard drive. Your computer hard drive didn't create the Windows programs or any of the data on it. It hosts it. And when that brain/hard drive crashes, the information is then uploaded. And it quantum leaps, if you will, from our material world dimension to the other side, which I call the afterlife frequency. And I tell people to think of your soul as a drop of water. And that when we die, that drop of water leaves the brain and plunges into the eternal sea of souls, which I call the collective consciousness. So then our electromagnetic soul is now energetically linked with other souls, linked with other souls, linked with other souls. Edgar Cayce referred to this phenomena as the universal mind. The Buddhists refer to it as the stream of energy that is life. The Hindus call it consciousness. Christians call it Christ consciousness. So it's a concept that is present in most of the world's belief systems. So now with a near-death experience, what happens is your electromagnetic soul temporarily leaves your body. So think of, here we are in the material world dimension, and your electromagnetic soul, your EMS, leaves your body. Now here's the other side. And in the zone in between, the EMS interfaces briefly with the collective consciousness. In other words, the tunnel, the light, encountering deceased loved ones, and depending on how far the NDE progresses, many people describe an encounter with the divine. Christians will say it was Jesus, Buddhists will say it was Buddha, Hindus will describe Hindu deities, atheists will describe something that they didn't expect that's just filled with energy, love, intelligence. Near-death experiencers don't think there's a God. They know there's a God. And even the word God is too limiting. So one of the things that I'm doing in the Afterlife Frequency is explaining the scientific basis for why NDEs occur. Now, if it's just I don't want to say just, but if it's a death experience, in other words, not a near death, then the EMS continues and then it completely aligns and enters the collective consciousness. But with the near-death experience, think of it's kind of on a rubber band. It's like, and it touches the afterlife frequency, but then comes back. And so when it comes back, or when you come back, that's why people have these recollections and these incredible life-changing experiences. So the difference between an NDE and a DE, a death experience, a near-death experience occurs in what I call the NDE zone. And that's one of the presentations that I give, which is in, think of our world as AM radio, the other side is FM radio, and the zone in between, occasionally the two frequencies will overlap. And that's where an NDE occurs. That's also where all forms of interdimensional communication, mediumship, deathbed visions, out-of-body experiences, they all occur there. So with an NDE, you die, but you live to tell the tale. With the electromagnetic soul, the EMS, the brain, which think of your body as a bottle and the brain is the cork. And the brain is the arbiter between our existence in the material world and the infinity that is the other side. And the brain is designed for finite perception. I mean, if you try to think of and really grasp always was, always will be, or that the universe is constantly expanding, and then you're thinking, well, into what? And we can't, the human brain is not capable of truly grasping timelessness. And once again, because we live in a finite world where everything that we experience has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so when when that cork is popped and the electromagnetic soul leaves the bottle, there is a period where the EMS is transitioning from a finite perception to encountering the infinite. So in that transition, when the EMS encounters the infinity of the divine, the EMS is still operating on our material world finite filters. So when you encounter the divine, you see, humans can't, because humans cannot comprehend infinity, we anthropomorphize it. In other words, it's easier for you and I, if you're Christian, to identify with the infinity that is God in the person that was Jesus. Likewise, for Hindus, Shiva, Vishnu, Krishna, Brahma, Lakshmi. For Shintos, Amaterasu. For Buddhists, Buddha. So in that narrow window between shifting from finite to the infinite, when we encounter the divine, we basically go to our default settings like, oh, this is Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus is a spiritual entity or Krishna as an avatar or Buddha as an avatar. I'm not saying that they don't exist. Okay, I mean, I believe that they do, but it is, we are trying to interpret the infinite, so we put a finite filter on it. That's why I'm always, I don't want to say I'm skeptical of anyone's near-death experience, but people that come back and say, well, everything that happened was right out of Scripture. And it's like, well, yes, because they were interpreting it through that filter. Because when I communicate with spirits that have made the transition from the finite to the infinite, and people ask about religion, they explain that God does exist, but not in a way that you can even begin to understand. And yet it's very simple to understand, because it's part of that energy is the power of love. But there's much, much, much more to it. For many people, a near-death experience is extremely disturbing, particularly if you're not surrounded by a welcoming and understanding support group. Some people are surrounded by hardcore skeptics and atheists who don't want to hear, oh, that's ridiculous, it's a side effect of a dying brain, and when you bring me back, I'll be able to shoot those theories apart. I wouldn't be a good lawyer if I didn't examine what the opposition has and then find out how to counter it. And the scientific proof counters all of it. Other people are surrounded by religious people who start saying, oh, this is evil, this is wrong. And certainly it can be very, very distressing, because nobody understands. You will change. A near-death experience is a life-changing event. I recommend certainly tuning into NDE Diary and listen to other people, but also join IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, IANDS, IANDS.org. Also, you can record your experience at NDERF, the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, NDERF, I believe, .org. And both are our sister organizations, because you shouldn't go through this alone. There's a lot of online groups where people have had NDEs can talk to other NDEers. And then you start finding out, well, maybe you're not so weird after all. And that also, what you've encountered is really a privilege. A lot of people that have had these spiritually transformative experiences. So look at your near-death experience not as a fluffy, buffy experience, but as a true gift from God, a true gift from the divine, whatever you believe. and take that experience and go with it. People can find out about me, about my book, signing up for readings. Please join my newsletter by visiting afterlifefrequency.com. It's just like my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency. I'm very humbled and honored. My book is recommended by NDERF, the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. It's recommended by IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and it just won the OMI Award for Metaphysical Book of the Year, the Best Holistic Life Inspirational Book of the Year, and the Cover Award for Best Book in Death, Grieving, and Reincarnation. And you can find out about all of that at afterlifefrequency.com. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in to NDE Diary with Eddie. Eddie, I want to thank you personally for having me, and for all of you, namaste, God bless, amen, amun, aho, peace, aloha. May God bless you.